the quietest voice in the room. It was 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday when the courtroom doors opened with a groan that echoed across the polished floors and marble pillars of Branch County Municipal Court. The space inside was thick with anticipation and something less tangible judgment. Heat rose in stale waves despite the early hour, clinging to the shoulders of those seated on rows of wooden benches that gleamed from decades of varnish and silent verdicts. You could hear the soft murmur of legal clerks shuffling files, the click of polished shoes against the tile, and the occasional cough reverberating like a misplaced gavel strike. Heads turned when the defendant entered, just 16 years old, small in stature, her dark hair pulled into tight braids that framed a face too calm for someone walking alone into that kind of storm. Her name was Alea Morgan. No lawyer accompanied her. No parent stood by her side. She walked to the defense table with shoulders back, shoes so clean they looked out of place on a courtroom floor, and eyes scanning the room like she was searching for a safe place to land. There wasn't one. "She's the one who spray-painted City Hall," a voice whispered from the third bench. "That mural girl," another added. "No dimos." Alea heard them, but didn't flinch. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her chin remained lifted. She made her way to her seat, like someone who knew this wasn't the end of her story even if everyone else thought it was. At the far end of the room, Judge Henry Ellison watched her with a gaze honed by 30 years on the bench. He was known for being curt, efficient, and wholly unimpressed by passion. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his black robe immaculate, and his reputation bulletproof. When Alea sat, he looked down at her over the rim of his glasses, the corner of his mouth tightening in a way that dismissed her existence before she even spoke. The prosecutor, Douglas Worth, stood like he'd rehearsed for this exact performance-grist suit, gold cufflinks, and a voice smooth like varnished wood. "Your Honor," he began, not looking at Alea, but motioning stiffly toward her. "The facts are simple. The defendant willfully vandalized city property in broad daylight, and not with some petty tag or meaningless scrawl. No, she painted a full-scale mural across a wall of City Hall mural that depicted scenes of police aggression and a message that questions the very legitimacy of our law enforcement institutions." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like concrete. This wasn't random mischief. It was calculated. Cameras caught her in the act. There is no ambiguity here. What we have is a teenager emboldened by social media who believes public property is her personal protest board. But this community must draw a line. Intentions aside, actions have consequences. Judge Ellison didn't nod. He didn't smirk. He merely removed his glasses, polished them with a white cloth, and said flatly, "So, she thinks she's a revolutionary." Laughter trickled through the courtroom, quiet, but sharp. A child with a paint can and an overinflated sense of righteousness. Ellison said, turning his gaze directly on Alea. "Miss Morgan, you're 16 years old. What, exactly, do you think you're fighting for?" Alea opened her mouth slightly, but no sound emerged. The judge leaned back with a sigh of thinly veiled irritation. "We've raised a generation that confuses rebellion for purpose," he muttered. "And now they bring that confusion into my courtroom." Silence returned, heavier this time. Alea sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap they turned pale. But her eyes didn't hold fear. They held something else, something just beginning to burn. She wasn't there to argue. She was there to remind them what they'd forgotten. "Your Honor," she said softly, her voice low but steady. "May I speak?" Ellison didn't even glance up from his notes. "No," he said flatly. "Just one word. One dismissal." Alea tried again. "I'd like to explain. This is not a classroom," he snapped. "This is a courtroom. You're not here to educate us, Miss Morgan. You're here because you broke the law." Her lips pressed into a line. Her fists tightened on the table, knuckles white. But she said nothing. Not then. Not yet. She stared ahead, not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, just ahead. At nothing. At everything. And in that stillness, something shifted, because silence can be strategy. And Alea had learned that from her father. She was 10 when her father, Clarence Morgan, sat her on their lopsided couch in their apartment on Fairmont Street. The couch smelled like lemon balm and warm laundry. He'd read to her each night from an old hardcover with yellowed pages and dog-eared corners. "This," he said one evening, tapping the spine, "isn't just a book. It's a map, a guide. When the world tells you to stay quiet, this teaches you how to speak." "What is it?" she'd asked. "Case law," he replied with a proud smile. "Real people who stood up, who knew what they were saying and why it mattered. That's power, Alea. Not shouting, knowing." He had once been a history teacher beloved by students, respected in the community until the school board fired him for going off script during Black History Month. He had told them the truth about injustice, about brutality, about stories textbooks refused to tell. And for that, he was dismissed. But he kept reading to her. On her 12th birthday, he gave her the book. "For the day you need it," he'd written inside the cover. "And you will." Now, in the gray holding room during recess, Alea sat cross-legged on the floor. That very book now, a stack of photocopied pages spread in front of her like sacred text. She traced the words on the page with a pencil she borrowed from the court clerk. "Thinker of Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. She whispered the title aloud. "Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate," she read again, underlining it slowly. She knew this case. She knew its heart. A student suspended for wearing a black armband in protest. The Supreme Court had ruled in the student's favor. So if protest was allowed in a school, why not on the steps of City Hall? No lawyer had come. No adult had stepped in. She was alone but not unarmed. She had the law and her father's voice. "They can ignore me," she whispered, "but they can't ignore the truth." Back in the courtroom, when recess ended, everything looked the same. But it wasn't. Not to her. Alea rose before anyone could speak, before Worth could resume, before Judge Ellison could wave her off again. "Miss Morgan," Ellison said, irritated, "you were not asked to speak." "I understand, Your Honor," she said. "But if the court intends to rule on my future, I believe I should be allowed to speak for myself." A few murmurs rose again, but she was already unfolding a page from her jacket pocket creased, nearly translucent at the edges. "I refer this court," she began, voice gaining strength, "to the 1969 case of Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District. In that case, the Supreme Court held that students do not shed their rights to freedom of expression at the schoolhouse gate. My mural painted on City Hall was not vandalism. It was protest, protected speech, just as Mary Beth Tinker's black armband was. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Judge Ellison's eyes narrowed not with disdain, but something else. Interest. Alea held up the page, revealing a highlighted paragraph. "If this court punishes me for it," she said, "it does more than silence a teenager. It rewrites precedent." In the back of the room, journalist Lauren Hayes froze mid-scribble. She'd come to cover a minor story team defaces public property. But now, as she watched Alea speak, something stirred in her. 12 years earlier, Lauren had been a student at Western County College. Her favorite professor? Clarence Morgan. He had once told her, "The First Amendment is a mirror. Look into it. Decide who you are." And now, in Alea's voice, she heard his echo. Lauren slipped outside, opened her laptop, and began typing. She wasn't just reporting. She was witnessing. The headline read, "Teen Cites Supreme Court in Stunning Free Speech Defense." It went viral before lunch. Back in chambers, Judge Ellison stared at the mural's photo. A man's face dark-skinned, eyes wide, hands raised. Beneath it, "Do I look threatening to you?" He remembered ruling against a boy like that once. And a mother. And another. Always quick. Always clean. Efficient. But Alea's words, they stuck. They didn't yell. They asked. He returned to the courtroom quietly. "No robe flare. No lecture." He looked directly at her. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I've reflected not on public noise but on what happened in this room. I dismissed you, not because your argument lacked merit, but because I assumed your age, your background, your voice couldn't carry the weight of truth." He paused. But truth does not depend on who speaks it. Justice does not bend to volume. Today, I reverse this court's earlier stance. All charges against you are dismissed. And then, after a breath, it is also the court's recommendation that the mural remain untouched. Let it serve not as rebellion, but as remembrance. Alea didn't cry. She nodded once. Outside, as the doors opened, no one spoke. They watched, because they were no longer looking at a defendant. They were looking at a voice. At the bottom of the courthouse steps stood Clarence Morgan. Gray sweater, old law book tucked under one arm, tears in his eyes. She walked straight into them. "You did it, baby," he whispered. "You made them listen." And for the first time in a long time, he did too. Every morning after, Judge Ellison paused before entering City Hall, just for a moment, to look. The mural remained, unpainted over, unapologized for, because sometimes justice doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the one they try not to hear. And sometimes all it takes is one girl, one truth, one man finally willing to listen.